Isabella Ravencrest paid $4 for what archaeologists claimed was worthless rubble. But when she broke through the sealed chamber walls, she discovered a royal conspiracy that had been buried for 3 centuries, and the people who killed to protect it were still very much alive. The estate auction was supposed to be routine. Isabella had driven 4 hours from her antique restoration workshop in Millbrook to the countryside outside Thornwick, hoping to find period furniture for her growing business. What she found instead was a crowd of impeccably dressed strangers bidding aggressively on everything except one particular lot that seemed to make them physically uncomfortable. The morning had started promising enough. Isabella arrived at Ravenshollow Manor, a sprawling Victorian estate being liquidated after the death of its last owner, to find nearly 100 potential buyers examining everything from Ming vases to mahogany armoires. The energy was typical for these high-end auctions, competitive, buzzing with whispered appraisals and strategic positioning. But something shifted dramatically when the auctioneer reached Lot 47. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, consulting his paperwork with obvious reluctance, "we now come to Lot 47, stone ruins located on the north section of the Ravenshollow estate, approximately 2.5 acres of archaeological remnants." Isabella studied the photographs clipped to the auction sheet with growing interest. Crumbling stone walls jutted from overgrown earth like the ribs of some massive buried beast. Previous excavation attempts had revealed what experts dismissed as the foundation of a medieval outbuilding, nothing more. The paperwork cited structural instability, limited historical value, and, ominously, access restrictions due to safety concerns. But Isabella's trained eye caught details the dismissive descriptions had missed. Even in the grainy photographs, the stonework looked sophisticated. The visible foundation blocks were massive, fitted together with precision that spoke of master craftsmanship rather than crude medieval construction. This wasn't some random agricultural outbuilding. The construction techniques looked older, more refined, and far more expensive than anything that should have been relegated to a countryside estate's back 40. "Opening bid set at $100, the auctioneer called, but his voice lacked the enthusiasm he'd shown for the previous lots. The silence was immediate and absolute. 100 well-dressed bidders who had fought viciously over crystal chandeliers and Persian rugs suddenly found their hands frozen at their sides. Isabella looked around the crowd, expecting someone to jump at what seemed like an obvious bargain. 2.5 acres of land with historical ruins should have attracted developers, history enthusiasts, or at least speculative investors. Instead, she watched a woman in a $1,000 handbag actually step backward when the auctioneer's eyes swept in her direction. An elderly gentleman with a gold-headed walking stick shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if warning the auctioneer not to look his way. A younger man in an expensive suit studied his shoes with sudden fascination. "Do I hear $75? The auctioneer tried again, his voice betraying confusion at the lack of interest. More silence. Isabella noticed something else deeply unsettling. Several people in the crowd weren't watching the auctioneer or examining their catalogs. They were watching her specifically, their gazes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Their expressions held a quality she'd only seen once before, at her grandmother's funeral, when the old woman had whispered deathbed confessions about family secrets that should have stayed buried. Not anger or annoyance, but a deep, uncomfortable pity mixed with something that looked suspiciously like fear. $50? The auctioneer was practically pleading now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. Isabella raised her hand halfway, testing the waters. $25. The reaction was immediate and deeply disturbing. Conversation stopped mid-sentence throughout the crowd. A woman near the front gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat as if she'd witnessed something obscene. An elderly gentleman with a gold-headed walking stick dropped his catalog, the pages scattering in the wind like autumn leaves. But the auctioneer's reaction was truly unsettling to Isabella. His gavel hesitated in the air as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of desperate concern. "Miss, are you absolutely certain this property comes with significant complications?" Before Isabella could ask what kind of complications, a voice spoke directly behind her, close enough that she could feel warm breath on her neck. "Don't do it, dear." Isabella spun around to find herself face to face with an elderly woman whose appearance was strikingly different from the other attendees. While everyone else wore the expensive, polished look of serious collectors, this woman's clothes were simple and well-worn. Her weathered hands and practical shoes marked her as local rather than a visiting buyer. "Cordelia Brightwater," the woman introduced herself quietly, her voice carrying the subtle accent of someone who'd spent her entire life in rural England. "That land you're bidding on, there's a very good reason nobody else wants it." "What kind of reason?" Isabella asked, though part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't be reassuring. Cordelia glanced around nervously, noting how many people were straining to overhear their conversation. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "4 families have owned that property in the last 50 years. All of them sold within months, usually at a loss. The last owner, Dr. Evangeline Ashworth, she was an archaeologist from Cambridge University. Brilliant woman, spent 3 years trying to properly excavate those ruins." "What happened to her?" Cordelia's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing something that had haunted her for years. "House fire. Middle of winter, stone fireplace, experienced country dweller who'd lived safely with fire her entire life. But somehow her cottage burned to the ground on the coldest night of the year, with her inside." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "That's unfortunate." "That's the 4th unfortunate accident connected to that property in my lifetime. Car crashes, falls downstairs, mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't diagnose. Some patterns aren't coincidences, if you understand my meaning." The auctioneer was still waiting, gavel raised, his discomfort growing more obvious by the second. The crowd remained frozen in an unnatural tableau, watching Isabella with those same pitying expressions that suggested they were witnessing something tragic and inevitable. "Going once for $25, the auctioneer called reluctantly. Isabella looked at the photographs again, her restoration expert's eye catching details that others might miss. The stonework wasn't just sophisticated, it was extraordinary. The foundation blocks were enormous, precisely cut limestone fitted together without mortar, in a technique she'd only seen in the finest medieval castles. The construction suggested not just wealth, but royal-level resources. More intriguingly, several sections of the ruins appeared to descend below ground level, as if the visible structures were only the upper floors of a much larger complex. The auction photographs showed mysterious openings where the earth had collapsed, revealing glimpses of dressed stone walls extending down into darkness. "Going twice." Something about the crowd's desperate collective desire for her to walk away made Isabella deeply suspicious. In her experience buying and selling antiques, when people tried very hard to discourage you from purchasing something, it usually meant they either wanted it for themselves or knew something valuable about it that they weren't sharing. But there was something else, something in the quality of their fear that suggested this went beyond simple commercial competition. These people weren't disappointed competitors. They were genuinely terrified for her safety. $4, Isabella called out, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. The effect was extraordinary. The woman with the expensive handbag actually staggered backward as if she'd been physically struck. The elderly gentleman with the gold-headed cane shook his head slowly, mouthing what looked like a prayer. Several people near the back of the crowd simply turned and walked away, as if they couldn't bear to witness what they believed was about to happen. "Miss," the auctioneer began, his voice shaking slightly, I feel obligated to mention that this property comes with extensive legal disclaimers. The estate accepts no responsibility for any incidents that might occur on the premises. Sold to the lady in the green jacket for $4. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo far longer than physics should have allowed. The sound hung in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell, and the crowd began dispersing immediately, not with the gradual social movement typical of auction endings, but with the urgent, purposeful exodus of people fleeing something dangerous. But Isabella noticed that while most people were leaving quickly, several individuals remained near their vehicles, watching her from strategic distances. They weren't departing. They were taking up surveillance positions. Cordelia Brightwater pressed a small piece of paper into Isabella's hand. "My phone number," she whispered urgently. "When you realize what you've gotten yourself into, and you will, call me immediately, day or night, and whatever you do, don't go there alone after dark." The auctioneer handed Isabella the deed with hands that trembled noticeably, avoiding eye contact in a way that suggested professional embarrassment mixed with genuine fear. "The property transfer is immediate. Keys to the site access gate are attached. I would highly recommend limiting your visits to daylight hours only, and perhaps bringing company." As Isabella walked toward her car, threading through the dispersing crowd, she caught fragments of whispered conversations that made her blood run cold. "Should have told her about the Whitmore family directly. Lady Rosalind won't tolerate another outsider poking around. Nobody's opened those sealed chambers since the last person who tried to expose the truth." Each conversation cut off abruptly when the speaker noticed Isabella listening. But the fragments painted a picture of something far more complex and dangerous than simple an archaeological site. There were powerful families involved, sealed chambers that hadn't been opened in generations, and a history of silencing people who asked too many questions. Isabella spent the drive back to her workshop trying to process what had just happened. She had attended dozens of estate auctions over the years, and she'd never encountered anything like the collective fear she'd witnessed today. Whatever was buried beneath those ruins, it was significant enough to terrorize an entire community into silence. But it was also significant enough that someone, multiple someones judging by the surveillance, considered it worth watching and protecting. And in Isabella's experience, things that powerful people wanted to keep hidden were often the most valuable things of all. The drive to her new property the following morning took 35 minutes through increasingly remote countryside. The road eventually narrowed to a single lane winding between ancient oak trees, whose gnarled branches formed a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. When she finally reached her destination, Isabella found herself facing an imposing wrought iron gate marked with signs that seemed designed to discourage all but the most determined visitors. "Private property," read the first sign, in letters large enough to be visible from a considerable distance. "Archaeological site, authorized personnel only," declared the second, though the metal was weathered enough to suggest the restriction had been in place for decades. "Danger, unstable ground," warned the third, and this one looked newer, recently installed with a bright yellow lettering that practically screamed liability concerns. But it was the fourth sign that made Isabella pause with her key halfway to the lock. "Whitmore Family Trust. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The Whitmore family. She'd heard that name whispered at the auction, spoken with the kind of reverence and fear usually reserved for natural disasters or terminal diseases. According to her deed, she now owned this property legally, but apparently the Whitmore family had some kind of historical claim or ongoing interest in the site. The key fit easily into the heavy padlock, and the gate swung open with a rusty screech that sent ravens scattering from the nearby trees in a black cloud of beating wings. Beyond lay a gravel path that had once been well maintained, but now showed signs of deliberate neglect, as if someone wanted to make the approach as uninviting as possible. Isabella drove slowly down the winding track, noting details that suggested this place had once been far grander than its current abandoned state implied. Stone markers along the path bore the remnants of carved inscriptions, too weathered to read, but sophisticated enough to suggest formal landscaping. Ancient oak trees had been planted in deliberate patterns, creating vistas and focal points that spoke of professional garden design. As she crested a small hill, the ruins came into view and Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The auction photographs hadn't done justice to the scope of what lay before her. This wasn't the foundation of some minor outbuilding. The stone walls formed complex patterns across nearly 3 acres, outlining what had clearly been a structure of extraordinary size and sophistication. Some walls stood nearly 15 feet high, while others had crumbled to mere suggestions in the grass. But the overall pattern suggested a building that would have rivaled the great houses of England in both scale and ambition. Isabella parked near what appeared to be the main entrance, a massive archway flanked by carved columns that bore the unmistakable marks of royal craftsmanship. She stepped out into morning air that felt strangely heavy, oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant cawing of ravens and the whisper of wind through ancient stone. The stonework was even more impressive up close than it had appeared in the photographs. These weren't the rough field stones of typical rural construction. The blocks were precisely cut limestone, each piece fitted with mathematical precision using techniques Isabella had only seen in medieval cathedrals and royal palaces. The craftsmanship spoke of unlimited resources, master stonemasons, and the kind of attention to detail that only royalty could afford. But it was the carvings that made her stop and stare in amazement. Along the top edges of the highest remaining walls, barely visible beneath centuries of moss and weather damage, were symbols that were unmistakably royal in origin. Crown motifs intertwined with heraldic shields, fragments of coats of arms, and what appeared to be Latin inscriptions in a style consistent with medieval royal documentation. Isabella pulled out her phone to photograph the carvings, but the screen remained completely black. No signal, despite having full bars during the drive from town. She tried turning the device off and restarting it, but it seemed as dead as if the battery had been removed. The communications blackout wasn't accidental. Someone was jamming electronic signals to this site, which meant someone was monitoring it closely enough to know when visitors arrived. The level of technological sophistication required for selective signal jamming suggested resources far beyond what a simple historical preservation society could muster. A shadow passed overhead, too large and too regular to be a bird. Isabella looked up to see a helicopter circling at a considerable distance, far enough away to maintain legal airspace, but close enough to observe her activities. As soon as she noticed it, the aircraft turned and disappeared beyond the tree line, but the message was clear. Her presence here was being watched by people with significant resources. Isabella spent the next 2 hours exploring the surface ruins, mapping the layout in a leather notebook she always carried for property assessments. The structure was far larger than it had appeared from the auction house photographs, with the foundations suggesting a building at least 300 feet long by 200 feet wide. Multiple wings extended from a central core, and what appeared to be formal courtyards had been laid out with the precision of palace grounds. But the most intriguing discoveries were the areas where the ground had partially collapsed, revealing glimpses of chambers and corridors beneath the surface level. Through gaps in the earth, Isabella could see dressed stone walls extending down at least 15 feet, suggesting that the visible ruins were only the uppermost floor of a much larger complex that had been deliberately buried over time. The engineering required to bury a structure of this size would have been enormous, far beyond the capabilities of casual abandonment or natural decay. Someone had made a deliberate, expensive decision to hide these buildings beneath tons of earth and stone. The question was, why? Isabella was examining one of the larger openings, trying to estimate the extent of the underground chambers when she heard the unmistakable sound of an approaching vehicle. She looked up to see a Range Rover navigating the access road with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey many times before. The vehicle stopped near her car, and a woman emerged who immediately commanded attention. She appeared to be in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested both wealth and authority. Her clothing was practical but expensive, hand-tailored riding clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Everything about her bearing suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Dr. Seraphina Blackthorne, she introduced herself, extending a hand with the casual confidence of someone who expected to be recognized. I represent the Thornwick Archaeological Preservation Society. We've been monitoring this site for quite some time. Monitoring it for what purpose? Isabella asked, noting that Dr. Blackthorne's grip was firm, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who did more than sit behind a desk. Preservation and protection. These ruins are extremely fragile, as I'm sure you can appreciate. We've been working for years to secure proper funding for professional excavation and conservation. Isabella looked around the ruins again, noting details she'd missed on her first examination. The collapsed sections weren't random or accidental. Someone had deliberately filled in parts of the structure, using rubble and earth to seal off areas that had once been accessible. The unstable ground warnings made more sense now. They weren't cautioning about natural erosion, but about areas where the concealed chambers might be accessed by someone determined enough to clear away the deliberate obstructions. "We'd be very interested in purchasing the property from you," Dr. Blackthorne continued smoothly. "I'm authorized to offer £25,000, cash, for immediate transfer of ownership." Isabella felt her eyebrows rise involuntarily. £25,000 for something she'd bought 24 hours ago for $4 was an extraordinary escalation. That's quite generous for what the auction house described as worthless archaeological remnants. Recent research has suggested the site may be more historically significant than previously understood. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, architectural analysis, preliminary dating of the stonework all indicate that proper preservation will require substantial resources. What kind of historical significance are we talking about? Dr. Blackthorne's professional smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Medieval construction, possibly connected to one of the great houses of the region. The architectural style suggests royal patronage, which would make it extraordinarily important for understanding the period. Isabella studied the other woman's face, looking for tells that might reveal what she wasn't saying. Dr. Blackthorne's credentials sounded impressive, but something about her manner suggested she wasn't primarily an academic. Her stance, the way her eyes constantly scanned the surrounding area, the slight bulge under her left arm that could have been shoulder holster, everything about her bearing suggested someone with security or military training rather than archaeological expertise. "I appreciate the offer," Isabella said carefully, "but I think I'd like to explore the property myself before making any decisions. I'm in the restoration business. This could be an interesting project." Dr. Blackthorne's professional facade cracked slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Miss Ravencrest, I don't believe you fully understand the complexities involved here. This site has a very complicated history. There are significant safety and legal concerns." "What kind of safety concerns?" "The kind that led to Dr. Evangeline Ashworth's unfortunate accident." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dr. Blackthorne had just confirmed what Cordelia Brightwater had implied at the auction, that the previous owner's death hadn't been accidental, and that similar fates awaited anyone who showed too much interest in what lay beneath these ruins. "Are you threatening me, Dr. Blackthorne?" "I'm trying to save your life," she replied, her voice dropping to deadly seriousness. "There are people with very powerful interests in keeping this site undisturbed. people who have already demonstrated they're willing to take extreme measures to protect those interests. What's really buried here? Before Dr. Blackthorne could answer, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching made both women turn toward the access road. 3 black Range Rovers were driving through the gate in formation, moving with military precision toward the ruins. "Dear God," Dr. Blackthorne whispered, her professional composure cracking completely. "They know you've been here." The vehicles stopped in a perfect tactical formation around Isabella's car, effectively blocking all escape routes. 8 individuals emerged with the coordinated movement of a professional security team. They wore expensive civilian clothes, but everything about their bearing, their positioning, their alertness, the way they automatically secured the perimeter, marked them as former military or intelligence operatives. The leader approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to absolute authority. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the bearing that only came from generations of inherited power and privilege. His clothes were impeccably tailored, his shoes handmade, and his entire presence radiated the kind of casual wealth that never needed to announce itself. "Miss Ravencrest," he said in an accent that spoke of Eton, Oxford, and centuries of English aristocracy. "Lord Maximilian Whitmore, I believe you've purchased something that has been under my family's protection for the past 300 years. Isabella felt her stomach drop as the pieces began to fall into place. The Whitmore family. The name she'd heard whispered at the auction with such fear and reverence. This wasn't just some wealthy collector or academic rival. This was the person who had been controlling access to this site for generations, and who apparently considered her purchase an unacceptable intrusion into family business. "According to this deed," Isabella said, holding up the legal documents, "I own this property through legitimate purchase at public auction." Legal ownership and rightful stewardship are often quite different things, Lord Whitmore replied with the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent his life having such distinctions explained away. "My family has maintained responsibility for this site since 1689. We're prepared to compensate you very handsomely for your understanding and cooperation." "How handsomely?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be extraordinary. £100,000. Cash, immediate transfer. You sign the papers, we handle all the legal details, and you walk away with enough money to expand your restoration business considerably. The escalation was breathtaking. $4 to $25,000 to £100,000 in less than 48 hours. Whatever was hidden beneath these ruins, it was worth an absolute fortune to the people trying to keep it buried. The kind of money that could change her life completely, or end it if she made the wrong choice. "What's really buried here?" Isabella asked, though she was beginning to suspect the question itself might be dangerous. Lord Whitmore's expression darkened, and for the first time, his aristocratic composure showed cracks. "Miss Ravencrest, some questions are far more dangerous than their answers could ever be. I strongly advise you to accept our offer and walk away from this place today." "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll discover why Dr. Evangeline Ashwith's research came to such an abrupt and tragic end." The threat was crystal clear now. Isabella was standing on a site that contained something so valuable, so incriminating, or so dangerous that people were willing to commit murder to protect it. But the very extremity of their reaction told her she'd stumbled onto something extraordinary, something that could be worth far more than the money they were offering, if she was brave enough, or foolish enough, to pursue it. As if summoned by her thoughts, a new voice spoke from the direction of the ruins, carrying clearly across the ancient stones. "Actually, Lord Whitmore, I think Miss Ravencrest deserves to know exactly what she's purchased before she makes any decisions." Everyone turned to see an elderly woman emerging from behind one of the taller walls, moving slowly but with unmistakable determination. She leaned heavily on an ornate walking stick, but her eyes blazed with the fierce intelligence of someone who had spent decades waiting for this moment.
Lady Octavia Thornfield. She introduced herself to Isabella, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had once moved in the highest circles of British society. And I'm the person who has been waiting 60 years for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to challenge the Whitmore family's stranglehold on the truth. Lord Whitmore's face went completely white, as if he'd seen a ghost rising from the grave. Octavia, you need to leave immediately. This doesn't concern you anymore. This has concerned me every day since they murdered my brother, every day since they silenced him for trying to expose what the Whitmore family sealed in those underground chambers.
Isabella felt her stomach drop. They're going to destroy the site. Dr. Blackwood was already gathering his things. We have to get there first. Agent Cross shook her head. Too dangerous. We'll coordinate with Border Patrol and... By the time federal agencies coordinate, the site will be stripped bare, Isabella interrupted. Those treasures have survived for 500 years. I'm not letting them disappear into private collections. Her phone rang again. This time it was Colt Ramirez. Professor, I'm calling from the site. I've been watching it since yesterday, and you've got serious problems heading your way. There are at least 3 different groups converging on this location. 3 groups? The Mexican team Colonel Martinez told you about, but also a helicopter full of what look like private military contractors and... Ramirez paused. This is going to sound crazy, but there's a convoy of black SUVs with government plates heading across the desert. Someone leaked the location, and now everyone wants a piece of the action. Agent Cross took the phone. Mr. Ramirez, this is FBI. You need to evacuate immediately. Ma'am, with respect, I've been protecting this site for 36 years. I'm not leaving now. Isabella stared at Agent Cross. You knew about the cover-up for 36 years? Not me personally, but yes, the FBI has been monitoring the situation. We were waiting for the right moment to expose the conspiracy without causing an international incident. And now? Now we're out of time. The helicopter ride to the site took 45 minutes. Isabella sat between Agent Cross and Dr. Blackwood, watching the desert landscape rush past below. In the distance, she could see dust clouds marking the approach of multiple vehicles from different directions. When they landed, Colt Ramirez was waiting with a shocking revelation. Professor, I need to tell you something. I haven't been protecting the site as a concerned citizen. He pulled out a faded badge. I'm retired CIA. I was assigned to monitor this location after the 1987 discovery. Isabella felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everyone knew? Not everyone, but yes, this has been a classified operation for decades. The problem is, some people got greedy. He pointed toward the approaching dust clouds, and some people got desperate. Agent Cross was coordinating with Border Patrol through her radio. We have authorization to secure the site, but we need to move fast. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Federal agents secured the perimeter, while Isabella, Dr. Blackwood, and a team of FBI archaeologists conducted an emergency excavation of the treasure vault. What they found exceeded even Isabella's wildest expectations. The rectangular depression beneath the pyramid contained a stone-lined chamber filled with artifacts that represented the cream of Aztec civilization. Golden masks, intricate jewelry, ceremonial weapons, jade carvings, and codices that had somehow survived 5 centuries in the desert climate. But the most significant discovery was a series of stone tablets that told the complete story of how Tenochtitlan's treasures had been evacuated. The tablets revealed that Aztec priests had established multiple hidden repositories across North America, of which this site was only one. Dr. Blackwood estimated the total value at $547 million, making it the most valuable archaeological discovery in North American history. 3 months later, Isabella stood in the Smithsonian's new Aztec Treasures exhibition, watching visitors marvel at artifacts that had been hidden for over 500 years. Vincent Ashworth and 17 co-conspirators had been convicted of archaeological fraud and conspiracy. The corrupt government officials who had facilitated the cover-up were serving federal prison sentences. Isabella's 25-cent purchase had not only made her the most famous archaeologist in the world, but exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and international art dealing. The site itself had been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with Isabella serving as the lead researcher for ongoing excavations. The Mexican government had formally recognized the site's importance and agreed to joint custody of the artifacts with the United States. But perhaps most importantly, the discovery had led to the identification of 12 other hidden Aztec treasure sites across North America, opening an entirely new chapter in the study of pre-Columbian civilization. Isabella kept the original deed to the property framed in her office, along with the 25 cents she'd paid for it. Students often asked her about the small change displayed so prominently. "Those quarters," she would tell them, "represent the most important lesson an archaeologist can learn. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from massive funding or institutional support, but from the courage to pursue the truth when everyone else is afraid to look." Isabella Restrepo had paid 25 cents for a piece of desert and discovered treasures worth $500 million. But more importantly, she'd learned that some truths are worth more than gold, and some discoveries are worth risking everything to protect. The treasures of Tenochtitlan had finally found their way home to the people, where they belonged. And Isabella found her place in history as the archaeologist who refused to let fear silence the voice of the past. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of discovery, courage, and justice. If this story inspired you, please subscribe and share it with others who appreciate tales of truth triumphing over corruption. Isabella's courage reminds us that sometimes the smallest investments, whether in money or in standing up for what's right, can yield the greatest rewards.
Sometimes Isabella would visit the site, walking among the ancient stones where she'd first glimpsed the truth. The 4-pound purchase had been the best investment of her life, not because of the money, but because it had shown her the person she was capable of becoming when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just enough. She was no longer just Isabella Ravencrest, antique dealer. She was the woman who had helped expose the greatest royal conspiracy in British history and proven that even the most carefully guarded secrets could be brought to light by someone brave enough to ask the right questions. That transformation was worth far more than any buried treasure could ever be. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, conspiracy, and justice. If you enjoyed this story of how one woman's 4-pound purchase changed history, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Your support means everything and helps us bring you these captivating stories of truth triumphing over power.